At 1:17 a.m., the Naval Support Activity Bahrain in the Jufair district of Manama was operating at its standard overnight tempo. The headquarters of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command and the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet occupied a compact, heavily hardened compound on the island's northeastern coastline, a facility that had been the operational nerve center of American naval power in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea for more than 3 decades, the place from which carrier strike group operations, logistics chains, and theater maritime security were coordinated across a 5 million square mile area of water. Inside the compound's operations center, the Night Watch was managing the routine traffic of a theater in active conflict. Aircraft positions, vessel tracks, threat assessments, the continuous low-level activity that characterizes a headquarters in sustained combat operations. The watch officer had been on duty since 10 p.m. She had 4 hours and 43 minutes remaining in her shift when the first alert arrived. The IRGC Aerospace Force had been planning the Jufair strike for 16 months. Not as a harassment operation, the routine rocket and drone attacks that had peppered American bases across the region during Epic Fury's preceding 3 weeks were harassment. This was different in kind and in intent. The Jufair compound was the single node in the American military architecture whose destruction or severe disruption would create the greatest immediate effect on the operational coherence of American naval power in the theater. Without the Fifth Fleet headquarters, the command relationships that coordinated carrier strike group operations, the logistics networks that sustained ships at sea, and the communications architecture that connected dispersed naval assets across the theater would be degraded in ways that took time to reconstitute. The IRGC's planning staff had modeled the operational impact with precision. They had concluded that a successful strike on Jufair, successful meaning sufficient damage to the operations center and command infrastructure to force a temporary transition to backup command arrangements, would impose a meaningful disruption on American naval operations at a moment when that disruption could affect the strategic balance of the conflict. The weapon mix reflected the sophistication of the analysis. 44 systems in a compressed launch window, 17 Fateh 313 ballistic missiles, the most accurate short-range ballistic missile in the IRGC's inventory, with a circular error probable of less than 10 meters and a penetrating warhead variant specifically designed for hardened facility attack. 14 Quds, 3 cruise missiles assigned to the facility's outer infrastructure, the fuel storage, the helicopter landing facilities, the maintenance buildings that were not hardened to the same standard as the primary operations center, but whose destruction would complicate the compound's ability to sustain operations over the days following an attack. 13 Shahid 131 loitering munitions, smaller than the 136, faster, carrying a shaped charge warhead optimized for penetrating the ventilation and access points that even hardened structures must maintain. The Fateh 313 accuracy was the key. The IRGC's targeting team had spent 11 months refining the coordinate sets for the Jufair compound's primary structures, using a combination of commercial satellite imagery, signals intelligence about the facility's internal layout, and human intelligence from contacts in the Bahraini contracting community who had worked on the compound's recent expansion. The coordinate sets were accurate. The targeting was real. The missiles that would carry those coordinates were real. What was not real was the assumption on which the timing had been built. The assumption was that the launch would occur before American targeting systems had characterized the specific launch complexes assigned to the Jufair strike. The IRGC's planning staff had assessed that the 3 ballistic missile brigades assigned to this operation, positioned at hardened facilities in Fars province that had survived previous strike cycles because they were buried deeper and more extensively than the forward-deployed systems that had been addressed in Epic Fury's opening phases, had not yet been precisely enough characterized for high-confidence targeting. They had been correct about that assessment as recently as 9 days ago. They were wrong at 1:17 a.m. on this morning, because 9 days ago, a human intelligence source whose access to the IRGC Aerospace Force's Ballistic Missile Command had been developed over 2 years of patient recruitment had provided the targeting package that the previous satellite and signals collection had not been able to produce with sufficient confidence. The source had provided building-level coordinates for the launch preparation facilities at all 3 FARS province complexes. The source had provided the personnel rotation schedules that identified when the highest concentration of technical specialists were present at each complex. The source had provided the specific missile types assigned to the Jufair strike and the launch window that the IRGC's operational planning had specified. The targeting analysts at Al Udeid had received that reporting at 11:22 p.m. the previous evening. They had spent 2 hours and 41 minutes cross-referencing it against existing collection, updating the target packages, and generating the confidence assessments that the strike authorization process required. The updated packages reached the Night Watch operations cell, which had been repurposed for this specific target set when the intelligence reporting arrived, at 2:03 a.m., which was to say, 56 minutes before the IRGC launched. The American strike package had targeting data of sufficient confidence to engage all 3 FARS province complexes. The aircraft assigned to that strike had been at 40-minute readiness since 1:30 a.m., when the operations cell had assessed the intelligence as indicating imminent launch activity at the complexes. At 1:17 a.m., the Space Force infrared constellation registered 17 simultaneous ignition events at the primary FARS province launch complex. The thermal bloom of 17 Fateh 313 first-stage motors lighting within a 23-second window. The warning reached the NSA Bahrain at 1:17 a.m. and 31 seconds. Simultaneously, it reached the Patriot batteries at 3 positions covering the Jufair compound. The Aegis systems of the USS Monterey and USS Roosevelt operating in the Central Gulf, and the THAAD battery positioned at a classified location in Bahrain's interior that had been specifically repositioned to address the Fateh 313 threat to Jufair 12 days earlier. The watch officer in the Jufair Operations Center received the alert at 1:17 a.m. and 44 seconds. She activated the compound's protective posture protocol, the sequence of alerts, movement directives, and system hardening procedures that the facility had rehearsed 12 times in the preceding month. The rehearsals driven by the same intelligence assessment that had characterized the Jufair strike as the IRGC's highest priority targeting objective in the theater. The protocol called for personnel to transition to hardened shelter positions, for critical systems to shift to redundant backup nodes, and for the backup command authority at NavCent's alternate command facility at a classified inland Bahraini location to assume operational control within 4 minutes of the protocol activation. The transition to backup command authority was completed at 1:21 a.m. and 33 seconds before the first Fateh 313 reached its terminal phase. The Jufair Operations Center was, at the moment the missiles arrived, a building that contained hardened infrastructure and shelter-protected personnel, but had already transferred its command functions to a facility that was not on the IRGC's target list. The THAAD battery engaged first, addressing the highest velocity Fateh 313 missiles in their mid-course phase above 60 miles altitude. The THAAD's engagement geometry against a Fateh 313 is close to optimal. The missile's relatively slow re-entry speed compared to longer-range ballistic systems gives the THAAD's kill vehicle more time to adjust its terminal approach and reduces the angular rate of the target that the infrared seeker must track in the final seconds of the intercept. 11 of the 17 Fateh 313 missiles were engaged by THAAD between 1:19 a.m. and 1:22 a.m. 9 confirmed intercepts. Two missed, one because the specific ballistic dispersion of that particular missile's re-entry placed it at the edge of the battery's engagement envelope, and one because the THAAD kill vehicle's terminal guidance update was degraded by a brief electronic interference event that the post-engagement analysis would attribute to a broadband emission from a plan vessel transiting the Gulf, whose radar emissions happened to overlap a critical frequency during the 3-second terminal guidance window. The two missiles that survived the THAAD layer continued their descent toward Bahrain. The USS Monterey's Aegis system had been tracking all 17 Fateh 313 missiles from the moment of launch, its SPY-1B radar maintaining continuous track through the boost, mid-course, and terminal phases. The two that survived THAAD were assigned to SM-2 Block 3A interceptors from the Monterey at 1:22 a.m. and 8 seconds, fired in shoot-shoot mode. 4 SM-2 missiles, 2 per surviving Fateh 313. The first pair of intercepts was confirmed at 1:22 a.m. and 51 seconds. The second pair at 1:23 a.m. and 4 seconds. Both surviving Fateh 313 missiles were destroyed at an altitude of approximately 18,000 feet above the Bahrain coastline. The warhead debris from both fell into the sea north of the Jufair compound. The Quds 3 cruise missiles were the more complex engagement. Sea skimming at 8 to 12 meters above the Gulf surface, their radar cross-section reduced by the wave clutter, and their low altitude compressing the radar detection timeline to a margin that the outer Patriot batteries could not reliably address. The USS Roosevelt, positioned 18 miles northeast of Bahrain in the engagement geometry that had been specifically calculated for this threat azimuth, took primary responsibility for the sea skimming layer. The Roosevelt's SPY-6 radar, more capable against low-altitude sea-skimming targets than the SPY-1B generation that had been the standard for the preceding 2 decades, acquired 9 of the 14 Quds 3 missiles at ranges between 22 and 28 miles. The Roosevelt fired ESSM Block 2 interceptors in a ripple sequence beginning at 1:20 a.m. and 44 seconds. 7 of the 9 acquired Quds. 3 were intercepted. 2 survived into the inner engagement zone. The inner zone was covered by the Patriot battery at the northern Bahrain position, which acquired the 2 survivors at 12 miles and engaged with PAC-2 GEM interceptors. Both were intercepted at ranges of 7 and 9 miles. 0 Quds. 3 missiles reached the Jufair perimeter. The 5 Quds, 3 that the Roosevelt had not acquired, the 5 that had transited through a low-altitude radar gap created by the geometry of Bahrain's coastline terrain, feature northwest of the facility, were addressed by the phalanx systems of 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters that had been repositioned to the coastal waters immediately north of the compound 14 days earlier, specifically to address the gap in the defensive architecture. The Coast Guard cutters were not warships in the conventional sense of that term. They did not carry the sophisticated Aegis radar and missile systems of the surface combatants. What they carried was the Phalanx Block 1B system in maritime mode, and what the Phalanx Block 1B in maritime mode does, what it does exceptionally well, is engage small, low, fast targets at close range with a volume of 20mm tungsten rounds that a sea-skimming cruise missile cannot maneuver to avoid. 4 of the 5 gap-threading Quds. 3 were engaged by the cutter Phalanx systems between 1:21 a.m. and 1:22 a.m. 3 were destroyed. 1 was hit but not fully destroyed, its airframe damaged and its guidance degraded, the missile veering off its programmed course and impacting the sea surface 400 meters west of the compound perimeter. The debris pattern from the damaged missile's sea impact scattered across a stretch of coastal water and an uninhabited section of a Bahrain reclaimed land project. 1 window in a harborside building sustained a fragment hit. No personnel were injured. The 5th gap-threading Quds. 3, the one that had come through at the lowest altitude and the highest speed, its sea-skimming profile kept below 12 meters through its terminal approach by a guidance update that the IRGC had incorporated after studying the defensive architecture from their previous attack cycles, reached the Jufair compound perimeter at 1:22 a.m. and 37 seconds and impacted the compound's outer vehicle parking area. The warhead detonated on contact with the parking surface. 8 vehicles were destroyed or damaged. A section of the perimeter blast wall was collapsed over a 15-meter stretch. The compound's communications antenna array, located 100 meters from the impact point, was undamaged. The hardened operations center, 230 meters from the impact point, was undamaged. The personnel who had been in the parking area at 1 a.m. had been in hardened shelters since 1:18 a.m. No American personnel were killed or seriously injured. The Shahed 131 element, 13 loitering munitions assigned to penetrate access points and ventilation systems in the compound's hardened structures, were addressed by a combination of the compound's internally positioned CRAM systems and the rolling airframe missile launchers of a patrol boat operating in the harbor immediately adjacent to the facility. The Shahed 131 is smaller than the 136, faster, and more difficult to acquire for the CRAM's radar in a cluttered coastal environment. 8 of the 13 were destroyed by CRAM and RAM before reaching the compound perimeter. 3 impacted the perimeter's blast barriers and detonated. The barriers performed their designed function, absorbing the blast and fragmentation from all 3 impacts without allowing the effects to propagate beyond the immediate impact zone. 2 Shahed 131s reached the compound interior. 1 detonated against an exterior wall of a support building, causing structural damage to the wall and a section of roof but not penetrating the building. 1 struck a satellite communications dish mount at the edge of the antenna array and detonated, destroying the dish and damaging the mount. The communications dish was a secondary system. The primary communications architecture, routed through hardened conduit pathways that did not pass through the antenna array, was unaffected. The Jufair compound's communications with the backup command facility, with the fleet, and with Al Udeid remained continuous throughout the engagement. 44 weapons launched at the nerve center of American naval power in the Persian Gulf. 1 impacted a vehicle parking area. 2 detonated against blast barriers. 1 destroyed a secondary communications dish. The hardened operations center was untouched. The personnel were in shelters. The command authority had transferred to the backup facility 11 minutes before the first missile arrived. The 5th Fleet continued to coordinate operations from a location that was not on the IRGC's target list, using communication systems that the IRGC's weapons had not reached, with a staff that was intact and operational. The response was designated Operation Steel Canyon. The strike package had been airborne since 12:54 a.m., 23 minutes before the IRGC launch, lifted to airborne readiness posture on the 40-minute authorization that the intelligence assessment had generated. 38 F-35A Lightning IIs from the 4th Fighter Squadron at Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE and the 421st Expeditionary Fighter Squadron at Prince Sultan, carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators and GBU-31 JDAM precision-guided bombs, 6 B-1B Lancer bombers. From their forward operating location, weapons bays loaded with JASSMER cruise missiles assigned to the surface infrastructure of all 3 Fars Province ballistic missile complexes. 4 EA-18G Growlers, whose jamming suites had been configured for the specific radar and communications frequencies of the IRGC Aerospace Force's Ballistic Missile Command Network, the frequencies through which launch authorization, targeting updates, and post-launch status reporting flowed between the Tehran command structure and the Fars Province complexes. The Growlers activated at 1:19 a.m., 2 minutes after the IRGC launch, severing the communications network that the Fars Province complexes used to report launch status and receive follow-on orders. The IRGC's missile commanders in Tehran lost contact with all 3 complexes within 4 seconds of the jamming activation. not because all communications were suppressed, but because the specific frequencies on which real-time operational coordination occurred were rendered unusable. The complexes still had emergency backup frequencies. Those frequencies had also been characterized and were also jammed. The operations staff at the Fars province complexes found themselves in the position of having just executed a major strike operation and being unable to confirm its status or receive guidance for next steps from their command authority. The HARM missiles addressed the launch complex radar infrastructure at 1:21 a.m. 8 AGM-88E from 4 F-35As, targeted against the acquisition and fire control radar systems that provided the complexes with air defense coverage. The Fars province complexes were not lightly defended. They were among the most heavily defended fixed military installations remaining in the IRGC Aerospace Force's inventory after 3 weeks of epic fury. The TOR-M1 short-range air defense systems at the primary complex attempted to engage the incoming HARM missiles. The TOR-M1 is a capable system against aircraft. Against an anti-radiation missile traveling at Mach 2.5 and homing on the TOR's own radar emissions, it is less capable. Both TOR batteries at the primary complex fired. Neither achieved an intercept. The TOR radars went offline, attempting to defeat the HARM by removing the emissions that it was homing on. But the HARM's inertial backup guidance carried them to the last known position of the radar and detonated within lethal radius. Both TOR batteries were rendered inoperable. The F-35A package reached their weapons release points beginning at 1:28 a.m. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators assigned to the buried launch preparation facilities at the primary and secondary complexes, the structures that house the propellant loading equipment, the missile assembly areas, and the technical support infrastructure that sustain the Fateh 313 launch capability, were released from altitude and fell through the 30 seconds of guided descent that separated release from impact. The first GBU-57 impact at the primary complex registered 2.3 magnitude on seismic networks in Oman at 1:29 a.m. and 14 seconds. The second registered 2.6 magnitude 11 seconds later. The progressive defeat sequence that the IRGC's own construction engineers had designed the facilities to resist, and that the GBU-57 program had been built to overcome. At the secondary complex, 2 GBU-57 impacts registered 2.1 and 2.4 magnitude at 1:31 a.m. At the tertiary complex, the smallest of the three, but the one that had housed the Shahed 131 launch infrastructure, 4 GBU-31 JDAM bombs addressed the surface facilities between 1:30 a.m. and 1:33 a.m. The B-1B Lancers addressed the surface infrastructure simultaneously. The propellant storage buildings at all 3 complexes, the above-ground structures that held the nitrogen tetroxide and UDMH that the Fateh 313 required and that could not be buried because of the safety margins required for liquid fuel handling, received JASSM-R impacts between 1:29 a.m. and 1:38 a.m. The fires at the primary complex propellant storage were visible on Space Force infrared at 1:31 a.m., their thermal signature distinct and intense in the way that hypergolic propellant fires are distinct and intense. The fires would burn for 6 hours. The tertiary complex's propellant storage was destroyed at 1:33 a.m. The secondary complex's storage, which had been partially emptied because the missiles assigned to the Jufair strike had already been fueled and launched, burned for 3 hours rather than 6. The volume of propellant remaining was smaller. The destruction was complete. At 1:46 a.m., 29 minutes after the IRGC launched its 44 weapons at the Jufair compound, the post-strike preliminary assessment reached the Steel Canyon operations cell. All 3 Fars province ballistic missile complexes had been struck. The launch preparation infrastructure at all three was assessed as rendered inoperable. The propellant storage was destroyed. The buried launch facilities at the primary and secondary complexes had received GBU-57 impacts assessed as reaching their designed penetration depths based on seismic signature analysis. The IRGC Aerospace Force's Fateh 313 launch capability in the Fars Province Complex Network, the capability that had spent 16 months targeting Jafar, was assessed as non-recoverable without reconstruction programs measured in years. In the Jafar Compound's Hardened Operations Center, the duty staff had received the all-clear at 1:44 a.m. and were completing the transition back from backup command authority. The compound's damage: 1 Quds, 3 impact in the vehicle parking area, 2 Shahed 131 impacts on blast barriers, 1 secondary communications dish destroyed, was being assessed by the engineering officer whose team had emerged from shelter with the all-clear. The assessment was completed at 2:11 a.m. Total damage to non-hardened infrastructure: significant. Total damage to operational capability: 0. The Fifth Fleet had coordinated carrier strike group operations, fleet logistics, and theater maritime security throughout the engagement from the backup command facility and had never lost the communications architecture with which it did so. The IRGC had spent 16 months and a significant portion of its most accurate ballistic missile inventory targeting the nerve center of American naval power in the Persian Gulf. They had achieved 1 crater in a vehicle parking area, 2 blast barrier impacts, and 1 secondary communications dish. The hardened facility that was their actual target, the operations center, the command infrastructure, the communications backbone, had not been touched. And the complexes that had made the attempt possible were burning in the Zagros foothills. Their launch preparation infrastructure collapsed, their propellant gone, their radar protection destroyed, and their ability to repeat the operation measured in years rather than weeks. The Persian Gulf at 2:11 a.m. was the same body of water it had been at 1:17 a.m. The carriers were still at sea. The strike groups were still operating. The Fifth Fleet was still coordinating from a compound in Jafar, whose operations center had never gone dark for a single minute of the engagement. The 44 weapons the IRGC had fired had not changed any of that. The 29 minutes that had elapsed between launch and the completion of the Steel Canyon strike package had changed the capability to try again. In the mathematics of operational reach, the most expensive investment is the one that buys less than its cost.